Hello, and welcome to this edition of Sarpy Outlook, a program in which we seek to advance democratic ideals from an issues-based perspective. My name is Randy Prier. My guest on this program is John Kretzschmar, Director of the William Brennan Institute for Labor Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Randy. It's a pleasure to be here.
As you might infer from John's title, I've asked him here today to talk about the state of labor unions in American society and politics today and in the future. First, before we get into it though, John, can you tell us a little bit about the Institute for Labor Studies and what you do there?
Well, the easiest way to explain it is probably to compare it to agricultural extension at UNL. They have a statewide mandate to provide farmers and ranchers with non-credit nuts and bolts educational training and skill building. And the Labor Studies program does the same thing, a statewide mission to provide non-credit education to leaders and advocates of unions to help them promote and defend what I call meaningful workplace democracy.
Okay, well that sounds like very important work. So let me start with a very basic question. Why unions? What's their purpose in their place?
It's a great question. Unions exist to help everyday wage earners bring meaningful workplace democracy to the job site. They use that democracy to raise levels of fairness and justice above the levels that employers left to their own devices would unilaterally impose, and employers have the legal authority to change those whenever they want. Unions bring that negotiated contract that means that for the life of the contract, the rule of law is in place, and neither party that negotiated it can change it in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. Well, can you briefly trace for us the history of unions in America? I'd say particularly from the time of the Depression, when they really got into the mainstream of things and with the involvement with Roosevelt and the New Deal, up until the peak of union membership at about 35% of the workforce in the mid-1950s.
Well, let's be clear that the history of organized labor is as old as the nation itself. The first unions were found in the port cities of our colonies, and it's kind of important to remember that the Founding Fathers met at Carpenter's Hall, not at the Chamber of Commerce. So unions were small in those days, only in large cities. You had to wait until the Industrial Revolution coming out of the Civil War and running up until the Great Depression for unions to grow, because at that point in time, people who were engaged in agriculture became wage earners. And as they became wage earners, they lost control over the quality of their life, and they brought unions into the workplace. And with industrialization, everyday wage earners were being treated less than kindly. They were being seen as an extension of
I think you're being gentle. Actually, the labor conditions for people at the start of the Industrial Revolution were pretty grim.
Right. Long days. We're talking 16-hour days. We're talking 6- and 7-day work weeks. We're talking poor wages, horribly dangerous conditions. One of the labor history books I read, the mine owner said, "I would rather lose 2 men than a mule." And he went on to explain that the reality is, to get new employees, all you had to do was put a sign out that said "hands wanted," but to get a new mule, he had to pay cash money.
Yeah. And child labor as well, working women.
Yeah. The reality is that every employee safeguard and protection that exists today, every step to humanize the employment relationship as it traced its roots from that Industrial Revolution in the 1880s to today, every one of those, organized labor has been in the forefront of advocating for them and making better. And so child labor regulation was one of the first. The ability to have equal pay for equal work, that happens under union contracts. The laws that created equal pay for equal work, first passed in 1963, unions were there. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, let's not forget that that was a creation of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And the AFL-CIO was there as well. A fellow named A. Philip Randolph helped organize that march, and it created the political will that allowed the Civil Rights Act to be passed. As importantly, probably, it's important to understand that each and every right and safeguard that an employee has in the workplace directly and indirectly raises the cost of doing business.
Yeah. And that gets to something that you indicated, which of course is that there's a natural conflict, if you will, between the employers who are looking to produce something at the least cost and the employees who are looking to have an honest day's wage in working conditions that are acceptable and safe.
Yeah, we got up to the Great Depression. Of course, the Great Depression was not just an American phenomenon; it was a worldwide phenomenon. And President Roosevelt was elected to office, and his public policy was aimed at creating jobs. And his analysis was the reason that jobs aren't there is employers need to have consumers for the products they produce. If there's nobody buying the stuff that's being put in the stores, they're not going to keep people employed. And so Roosevelt said one of the things we need to do is we need to put money in the pockets of consumers, and once we are able to create a demand for goods and services, then people will get back to work. And so the Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Labor Relations Act, all of those were tools that gave everyday wage earners jobs once again. The building on UNO's campus, the oldest building on UNO's campus, which is now called the Arts and Science Building, was a product of the WPA.
Yeah. So this is when really the association between labor unions and the Democratic Party really began. And they, from that point on, the labor unions have been an important and indeed an essential part of the Democratic coalition that has led to much of the Democratic Party's success over the last more than half a century.
Absolutely. The coalition that Roosevelt put together, labor played an important part in that. And the reality is that the Democratic Party, from that period on, historically, was the party that introduced those kinds of bills, supported that kind of legislation that gave everyday wage earners a voice, a meaningful voice, in determining their future quality of life.
Now, some things happened after Roosevelt was gone, after World War II, that had almost an equal impact as some of the things we've talked about on the labor union movement. Can you talk about some of those things that happened in the immediate aftermath of World War II?
Labor unions peaked, their density peaked in the 1950s, but there was a brief period from 47 to about 73, a 25-year period where, when union density was at its peak, our nation's economic might was most broadly and fairly shared. But about 1973, you see that the average wage for a non-supervisory worker begins to fall and not keep up with the cost of living. It's at that point the American dream began to fade. And I would argue that as union density fell, so did the ability of everyday wage earners, the middle class, if you will, their ability to earn and maintain a standard of living that stayed up with the good old days, the 50s and 60s and even early 70s.
Well, that comes to one of the real questions that I wanted to get at, and that is that considering the success that the labor unions had from the New Deal up to the 1970s, as you indicate, what are the reasons that things started to turn around and contract? Now, we've seen as you indicated, the density of labor union membership among the private sector was something like 35% in the mid-1950s, and now today it's dwindled down to somewhere around 11 or 12%, although the public sector union density has had some growth recently.
Absolutely.
The larger public or private sector rather has continued to decline.
Yeah, remember the private sector union density at 35%, that meant lots and lots and lots of folks were part of organized labor. And as part of organized labor, they were able to do fairly good things for themselves and their families and the communities in which they lived. But management never lost its desire to become leaner and meaner, to do more with less. And they were able to affect public policy that essentially allowed factory owners, the Industrial Revolution, allowed factory owners to put their plants on barges and move them around the world to seek lower and lower and lower wages. That was a primary reason for the private sector to disappear. The public sector union density went up because public sector elected officials and managers also bought into the leaner and meaner and do more with less. And most people remember Dr. King was killed in 1968. They may not remember it was in Memphis, but hardly anybody remembers that he was there trying to help public sector workers gain a meaningful voice and have a say in their future quality of life. That's a critical issue.
And let's not be afraid of being a little bit blunt. It actually was in the Republican Party's interest to see a decline in labor because labor had been such an important part of the Democratic coalition, as we had mentioned. And so they were kind of cooperating.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lyndon Baines Johnson pretty much signed the death warrant for the Democratic Party in the South when he enacted both the Civil Rights Act and a couple of years earlier the Equal Pay Act. And then a year after that, the Voting Rights Act. Those three bills took the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, and caused them to run into the arms of the Republican Party. The Republican Party had a Southern strategy, and it is still working well to this day. Democrats in the South, in the old days, the Dixiecrats, the conservatives, are now Republicans.
Yeah. Well, many people have noticed that there is a corresponding decrease in the wage levels of most of the workers in the United States versus the rise in income of the top several percent of the wage scale, and that apparently is no accident.
No. It's my belief that when unions are at their peak, they are able to either through legislation or through negotiations or through something I call the trickle-up and spillover effect. For every percentage increase in productivity, they were able to negotiate a percentage increase in wages. Since the mid-'70s, their ability to do that has declined, and while productivity has gone up dramatically, the people who helped create that wealth do not share in it the way they did when unions were high. Union density was high. And so the oversimplification of the rich getting rich and the poor getting poor seems to apply in a period when union density is very low.
Well, that leads us to the question of the future then. What do we feel is the future for the American labor movement, and what can and should be done to increase the health and influence of the movement?
I think unions will be around as long as management in both the public and private sector follow the mantras of do more with less and get leaner and meaner. Wage earners are human beings. All work deserves some dignity. As the strikers in Memphis in 1968 said, they didn't carry around picket signs saying greater wages, safer work. They merely carried around signs with 4 words on it: I am a man, all in bold caps. That need to have some dignity and respect at work is always going to be there. And it's important for everyday wage earners, the people who watch this, the general public, to think of themselves more as wage earners and to understand without a union, the employer has the unilateral right to change wages, hours, terms, and conditions of employment for a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all. unless they violate certain federal protections. And each and every one of those federal protections, those employers fought against because those safeguards directly and indirectly raise the cost of doing business. So once people think about that and think about how important it is, I think they'll start understanding unions in a different light.
Okay. Well, John, I very much appreciate you being here with us. We could carry this discussion on for a long time. And I must say that I really had a great deal of pleasure in preparing for this interview because you're a fascinating person, a lot of information, a lot of good stories. So I appreciated the time that we spent together.
You're most kind. It was a great opportunity, and I joked that the back of my business card should say, "Have soapbox, will travel."
Well, thank you very much once again, John. This has been Sarpy Outlook. My name is Randy Prier. Thank you all for viewing.